Welcome to the Essential GovCon Brief podcast from the Government Contracts team and Gordon Reese, where we break down the latest contracting developments. I'm Patrick Burns, and here with my co-host, Laegan Meyers.
Hi, Patrick. So March closed out with a major policy shift with the March 26th executive order on addressing DEI discrimination by federal contractors. It builds on the earlier executive order 14173 from last year, but this one goes further in how it ties compliance directly to payment and the False Claims Act.
Right, so Executive Order 14173, titled Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity, issued in January of last year, and named diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as a potential civil rights violation. So this new executive order operationalizes, essentially, that by mandating certain contract terms. So within 30 days of its issuance, which would be April 25th, just a few weeks from this recording, agencies must insert this new clause into every federal contract, which also must be flowed down to each subcontract.
And that clause does a few important things. First, it prohibits contractors from engaging in what it calls racially discriminatory DEI activities. Second, it gives federal agencies broad authority to request and obtain any information and reports they want. And third, it makes contractors responsible for reporting suspected violations by their subcontractors. The most consequential part is this: contractors must certify that compliance with these requirements is material to getting paid by the government. That said, this wasn't entirely new. That expectation was already implicit under the prior executive order.
Exactly. And that certification requirement is what brings the False Claims Act front and center. So if a contractor invoices the government while maintaining programs the administration later considers unlawful DEI, the DOJ could conclude it was false and assert an FCA claim. This claim could also be asserted similarly by a whistleblower. And even if the company believed it was following Title VII, that belief might not stop an FCA complaint from being filed.
And so we're back in this tension between EO requirements on one hand and Title VII obligations on the other. Title VII doesn't require DEI programs, but it does expect employers to prevent discrimination and harassment within the workplace, often through training and policies. So how do you stay compliant with both?
So the safest approach here is to audit, document, and narrow your active DEI programs, whether they are mentoring networks, leadership pathways, or supplier diversity goals. And it's important to note that the government still needs to eventually prove to a court that the DEI, whatever DEI program, was actually unlawful, and the government cannot unilaterally deem the DEI policy or program unlawful without relying on an existing statute. So not all DEI programs are automatically unlawful just because the administration says they are.
And it's not just for the employment programs. The order also reaches contracting and procurement decisions. So supplier diversity language may need a careful legal review. It's fine to seek a broad pool of vendors, but favoring firms solely based on ownership demographic could now trigger scrutiny.
Another big compliance angle is documentation. Agencies can demand your records. Contemporaneous reasoning becomes very critical. So don't just end a program overnight. Record why you're making the change, show neutral business justifications, and make sure management communicates it clearly. So otherwise, those timing decisions could be used later as evidence of bias in a Title VII case.
Right. And don't forget your flow down clauses. Every subcontract will have to include this new DEI certification. Primes will bear the risk if a sub's practice violates it. So you have to add written representations and periodic checks.
Practically, contractors should expect a patchwork rollout by these agencies. So different agencies will enforce the clause set forth in this new executive order likely differently because each agency will designate its own compliance official. Some might send detailed questionnaires, others may just rely on voluntary disclosures, and we're working at present in very much an unknown. Still, DOJ has been directed to prioritize enforcement under the FCA. So these lawsuits could outpace agency reviews.
So if you remember last year's litigation over Executive Order 14173, you know legal challenges to these mandates are already moving through the courts. And while some courts initially issued partial injunctions limiting enforcement of the prior executive order, with the exception of the contracts with the Department of Labor, the prior executive order remains enforceable. So contractors can't assume this newly issued executive order will be paused or overturned anytime soon.
Right. And that means your compliance strategy certainly can't wait for the next court ruling. And so here are the steps that we are recommending to our clients on this. So first and foremost, certainly is audit any current DEI policies with the help of legal counsel. The second is to document any decision making, create a record of good faith legal analysis, what risks you reviewed, what changes are made, and how you maintain equal opportunity in the workplace. The third is flow down and train. So update subcontract clauses and then brief your program manager so everyone understands the new requirements and potential FCA exposure.
That captures it perfectly. The bottom line is that the administration's focus isn't just policy, it's enforcement leverage. These executive orders shift DEI compliance from aspirational language to contract performance risk.
Exactly. So neglecting the executive order could mean a payment hold, termination, or even a False Claims Act suit.
We'll keep watching for the FAR Council's implementation of the rule and for or early enforcement actions. So we appreciate you listening to the Essential GovCon Brief. You can read our full written analysis on this executive order at grsm.com.
And you can subscribe on Spotify or YouTube for future updates. I'm Patrick Burns.
And I'm Laegan Meyers. Stay compliant, stay informed, and we'll see you next time.